There is a particular silence a great hall makes when its king says something foolish. It is not the silence of respect. It is the sound of 30 clever people deciding, all at once, to study the grain of the table. I had heard it twice in my life. I heard it a third time on the first cold morning of the autumn hush, and the only person in that hall who did not look at the table was the maid standing by the door with my cloak folded over her arms. She was laughing. Not aloud. Nothing about her made a sound, but her shoulders had gone and her chin was tucked, and above the fold of my own gray cloak her eyes were bright and wet and absolutely merciless. "Sire," said Lord Garrow into the silence, gently, the way a man steps around a hole in the road, perhaps before the hush is hasty. I had just informed my council that if they were determined to marry me to Lady Corisande of Meran, they might as well have it done before the bells fell quiet, and be spared the trouble of asking me twice. It was, I understood a heartbeat too late, an insult to a woman who had done nothing but be born convenient. It was also the truth. The truth is very often bad manners. Before the hush, I said, was perhaps hasty. 30 men agreed with the table. And in the marrow of my skull, in the place where for 12 years there had been only weather, something spoke. "She thinks you're an idiot." I will tell you what that was like, because I have had years to find the words and I have never once found better ones. It was like standing under a great bell 3 heartbeats after it is struck. Not the strike. The strike is nothing. It is what comes after, the hum that gets into the stone and the boot soles and the wet of your eyes, the sound that is not a sound but a ringing, 100 bronze voices agreeing on one word. That was in me, and the word was hers. My wolf had never spoken to me. Understand that. Every wolf born of Thelvane carries a second self. My father called it the gray, his father called it the old dog, and there is not a farmer between the sea and the beach hills who does not know the feeling of his own wolf leaning against the inside of his ribs when a stranger comes up the lane. It is weather, hunger and warning and a want you cannot argue with. It has no words. It has never had words, not for me, not for the king before me, not for anyone I have ever met. "She thinks you're an idiot," my wolf said, in the plain and cheerful voice of a man delivering good news, and I have decided to agree with her. I stood up so fast I put my hand through a jug of small beer. 30 men rose with me, which is the curse of the crown. You cannot even be mad in private. Garrow said something about the hour. I said something about the bells. I walked out of my own council chamber with beer on my knuckles and my heart going like a hoof in a stall, and at the door the maid held out my cloak with her head bowed, and the moment I passed her the ringing in my skull swelled so loudly that I stopped dead in the passage and put a hand against the wall. "Oh," said my wolf reverently, "oh, she smells like beeswax." I turned around. She had gone still as a hare in bracken, gray homespun, sleeves pinned back over forearms corded like a rope maker's, bell black under her fingernails, a brown, weathered, unremarkable face and eyes as steady as a level. She was not laughing now, but there is a place at the corner of a mouth where laughter goes to hide, and I could see the door of it. "Do you find me amusing?" I said. She looked at me. She raised her hands and they moved a fold, a turn, a small precise gesture like a woman setting a stitch, and then she lowered them and waited, and I understood nothing at all. She said no, my wolf offered, "She's lying." "Dame Holly's," I said without turning. My steward was, as she always is, 4 feet behind me and 11 seconds ahead. "Who is this?" "The bell-maid, sire, down from Ash Hill for the hush. She has the grandmother's tuning." "Why does she not answer me?" "She is of the long quiet, sire." A pause in which my steward did not sigh out of long practice. "They are vowed, 5 years, she has 3 left." I looked at the maid of the long quiet. She looked back with the flat, patient, entirely unimpressed calm of a woman who has spent 3 years perfecting the art of not being asked her opinion. "Ask her name," said my wolf. Ask her name, ask her name, ask her. Get her out of my hall, I said, and walked away from all of it. You must know what the hush is, or none of the rest will mean anything. For 7 days at the turn of autumn, Thelvane goes quiet. It is the oldest law we have, and the only one nobody has ever tried to break. No bells, no hunting horns, no market cries, no wedding drums. The kingdom lets its own voice down like a man setting down a load he has carried since spring. On the 8th dawn the grandmother is rung. The great bell in Hollowbeam's north tower, 4 tons of her, older than the crown by 200 years, and every bell in every village answers, and that is the year turned over. And in the 7 days between, we do our talking with our hands. Every wolf-born child in this kingdom learns the hush speech before they learn their letters. Yes, no, bread, come here, I'm sorry. My mother taught me sitting on the cold step of the glass house. She taught me I'm sorry first because she said I would need it most, and she was correct, though not in the way she meant. The house of the long quiet keeps the speech the way a granary keeps seed. They are not a holy order. They are a hearing order, though I did not know what that meant then. Nobody does, outside their own hill. They live in a low bell house in the beeches above Hollowbeam. They hang and tune and mend every bell in the kingdom. They take a vow of 5 years' silence in their prime, and they come down among us only to work. And once in a generation they send down whoever has the grandmother's ear, because the grandmother is 4 tons of stubborn old bronze, and there are perhaps 4 people alive who can hear when she has gone sour. That autumn she was sour. I had heard it myself in the summer and pretended I had not. That autumn they sent Nella. I did not learn her name for 11 days, because I had banished her by suppertime. That is not fair. I did not banish her. I told Dame Hollies that the bell-maid was to work at night, when the towers were empty, and to keep clear of the hall, the yard, the passages, my study, and the north stair between the 7th and 11th hour, which is the route I take from my rooms to everywhere else. That is banishment, sire, said Hollies, with extra steps. She was laughing at me. Yes, sire, said Hollies, so was I. I dismissed her and she went, and I sat in my study with the fire going and my hands flat on the desk, and waited for the ringing in my skull to come back, and it did not. Weather, only weather. My wolf lay in me the way he had lain in me since I was 9 years old, wordless, a warm animal pressure behind the ribs, sulking now like a hound shut out of a warm room. I could feel him. I could not hear him. It was like going deaf in an ear I had not known I possessed at the age of 34, having heard exactly 9 words with it in the whole of my life. She thinks you're an idiot, and I have decided to agree with her. 9 words, and I turned them over all that night, the way a man turns a coin he suspects is false. I decided I had gone mad. That was, on the balance of the evidence, the sensible conclusion. Kings go mad. It is practically expected of us, and my father had set a poor example by dying sane and leaving the whole business to me. But a madman hears voices at midnight in the dark alone. I had heard mine in a bright hall in front of 30 men, and it had told me a woman smelled of beeswax, and it had been perfectly and infuriatingly right, because when I lay down that night I could still smell it, beeswax and bronze dust and cold beech leaves, as if she had been carried through my rooms and set down in the middle of my bed. 6 days later, the grandmother went sour in the throat. She had a crack in her crown, hairline, ancient, packed with 2 centuries of bronze black, and in the wet of a Thelvane autumn she began to sing flat. A great bell going flat is not like a fiddle going flat. It is a sound with a bruise in it. It goes into the hill and comes back wrong. Dogs in the lower yard began to howl at noon. 2 of the kennel bitches would not eat. A carter's mare put her foot through a hurdle and had to be destroyed, and the carter wept, and my hound master came to me with his cap in his hands and asked, very politely, whether the king intended to ring the year in with a sound that made the beasts of Thelvane want to die. Where is the bell-maid? I said. Sent home, sire, said Dame Hollies, By your order, on the third day. There was a silence in my study of a sort I have since become well acquainted with. It is the silence a man makes when he has just met himself coming the other way. Saddle the gray, I said. Ash Hill in the last dark before dawn. Beech woods with the leaf fall going to copper underfoot, mist lying in the hollows like milk poured in a bowl, and at the top, a long low house of gray stone with a bell frame beside it and no light in any window. I rode up alone. A king does not ride anywhere alone. I have had the argument since many times, and I have never once won it and never once lost it either. There was a bell hung by the door, small and green with age, and beside it a stone let into the wall, worn concave in the middle by 400 years of knuckles. You do not ring at the long quiet, you knock. The woman who opened the door was 70 if she was a day, with a bell-hanger's shoulders and one eye clouded to the color of skimmed milk. She looked at me. She looked at my horse. She looked at the crown I was not wearing and the mud on my boots and the fact that it was an hour before dawn, and she did not bow. Keeper Ivan, she said, you'll be the king. I have come for the bell-maid, said Keeper Ivan, and left the door open and walked away into her house, which is not a thing that has ever happened to me before or since. Their hall was warm and low-beamed and smelled of tallow and bronze filings. 4 women sat at a long table eating porridge and did not look up. Their hands moved above the boards, quick and low and constant, and the room was as loud as any tavern I have ever drunk in, and there was not one single sound in it. Ivan set a cup in front of me and sat down and folded her hands. She's tuning the little bells for the villages, she said. She'll be down at first light. You could have sent a boy. I sent her away. I know what you did. The clouded eye did not blink. She came up the hill on the third day with her tools on her back, and a note from your steward saying the king had no further need of her services. Do you know what my hands are for, sire? Bells. Bells, Ivan agreed, and keeping. Sit down, you're looming. We hang bells and we tune bells and we keep the silence, and we keep other things. She turned her cup a quarter turn on the wood. Do you know why we are vowed, sire? Not the tale they tell in your hall, the reason. I have never asked. No, she said. Nobody has in 400 years. It's a marvelous system. Somewhere above us a bell touched. Once, so lightly it was more of a shiver than a note, and then a second, a fourth above it, and I felt the hair go up on my arms without knowing why. That's her, said Ivan. And in me, so suddenly that my hand jumped and the cup went over and porridge-warm ale ran off the table onto my knee. The ringing came back. There she is, said my wolf in a voice like a man throwing open every window in a house. Oh, thank the moon. Say something clever. I sat in the hall of the long quiet with ale in my lap, and my heart slamming and 4 vowed women watching me with their eyebrows very high, and I understood 2 things at once. The way you sometimes see the whole shape of a country from a hill. The first was that I was not mad. The second was that my wolf had been trying to say something for 12 years, and had only now found an ear in the kingdom that would take the message, and it was not mine. Keeper, I said when I could, I have changed my mind about the bell-maid. Kings do. She is needed at Hollowbeam. Very likely. Send her down. Keeper Ivan looked at me with her one good eye for a long moment. Then she stood and went to the door and looked out at the gray beeches, where a small figure with a satchel over one shoulder was coming down out of the mist with her breath smoking, taking the path the way people take a path they have walked 10,000 times, without watching their feet. I don't send, said Ivan. She goes if she wills and stays if she wills, and neither you nor I will ask her twice. That's the whole of our law, sire, and it's older than yours. Then ask her once. Ask her yourself, said the keeper of the long quiet, and stood aside from her own doorway to let a king out of it. She stopped 10 feet from me on the path, and she did not bow either at first. She only stood, with the mist to her knees and the satchel of little bells against her hip, and looked at me with those level eyes, and worked out that I had ridden up a hill in the dark. Then she bowed. It was a fine, correct, entirely insulting bow. "Ask her name," said my wolf, at a volume that made my eye water. "I have addressed 9,000 men from a saddle. I have told a foreign envoy to his face that his lord was a liar, and watched him decide to agree with me. I stood on that path with my mouth open and nothing whatever in it." "The grandmother has gone sour," I said at last. She nodded once, unsurprised, and something moved through her face, not triumph. Worse, concern for the bell. She lifted her hands and shaped something in the air, 3 motions, precise as a knot. "I don't understand you," I said. Her jaw tightened, very slightly. She turned and set her satchel down on a stone. Then she crouched, and with one blunt finger she wrote in the wet leaf mold of the path, in letters of bell-hanger cuts, square and deep. "Her crown, not her mouth. Can you mend it?" She was already picking up the satchel. She walked past me down the hill, not fast, not slow, and after 4 steps she stopped and looked back and jerked her chin at the horse, and at me, with an expression of such profound and weary patience that I have seen it since only on the faces of very old midwives and very good sergeants. It said, "Well, come on then." I brought a bell-maid down Ash Hill on my own saddle-bow with her tools rattling and her spine straight as a hanging rope, and all the way down, at a volume that would have deafened a man with an ear for it, my own wolf sang. "Hours," he said. "Oh, at last, at last, at last, hours." And she rode in front of me with her chin up and her hands quiet, and she did not turn her head, and she did not blush, and she did not once, in the whole of that hour, stop shaking with laughter. "Now, you will already have run ahead of me because you are not a king and therefore not required to be a fool. Hold that. Let me have it in its order, and you will see how a clever man arrives at a truth 6 weeks late. Here is what I knew in the first week, that my wolf spoke, and spoke only when she was in the house. Not in the room, in the house. The ringing came up in me on the north stair when she was in the tower. It thinned to weather when she went up the hill on her rest day, and I sat in an empty study with a silent skull and discovered, to my extreme irritation, that I missed him. Here is what I did not know, that it went both ways. She worked at night at first, because I had ordered it, and neither of us was going to be the one to say otherwise. She had the grandmother down out of the frame in 3 days, which is a thing that ordinarily takes a fortnight and 11 men. She stitched the crack with a bronze key driven cold. I watched her do it from the tower stair like a boy watching a farrier, and I will not pretend I had business there. She had a way of putting her ear against 4 tons of bell, and closing her eyes, both palms flat, the way you would listen to a horse's belly. "She's beautiful," said my wolf, into the ringing dark. "She is not," I said aloud quietly to nobody on the 4th step of the north tower. "She is competent." "Do you know," said my wolf, "I have never once thought a thing you didn't think first. I only say them." And 40 feet below me in the bell loft, with her ear against the bronze and her eyes shut, the bell-maid of the long quiet lifted her head and looked straight up into the dark where I stood, and I went down that stair like a hare going into a hedge. In the 2nd week, my wolf began to hold opinions about my counsel. "Garrow has hair in his nose like a thistle," he observed, in the middle of a boundary suit that had been running since my grandfather. "Look at it. You could stuff a saddle." I looked at it. I have never in my life been able to look at Lord Garrow since. By then she had left off the nights. It was the steward's doing. Holly said the tower work needed daylight for the sight lines, and I said fine, fine, and did not look up from my papers. And thereafter a grave brown woman in gray homespun crossed my hall 4 times a day with a satchel of bronze bits, and served at table when they were short-handed at the hush feasts, and stood by the door with my cloak, and my kingdom's business began to take me, quite unaccountably, past the north tower. "Give her your cloak," my wolf said at supper. "She's cold. Look at her hands. Give her your cloak, you enormous coward." "Sire," said Lady Corisande of Marin, at my right hand, because I had made a small sound. "Nothing," I said, "the wine." Corisande was, I must be honest, and it is not to my credit, a perfectly excellent woman. 28, clever, rode like a demon. She had been sent to Hollowbeam at the beginning of autumn with 2 aunts, an inventory of her mother's holdings in Marin, and the profound understanding of everyone concerned that by the hush she would be betrothed to the Alpha King of Thelvane, who had reached 34 without a mate, and whose council had begun to speak in low voices about the succession, the way one speaks about a leaking roof. I had no objection to Corisande. That was the whole trouble. A man may be very nearly happy for years on no objection. "I object," said my wolf. "You are not consulted." 12 years, he said. 12 years I have gone about in your chest like a stone in a boot, and you never once heard me say so. And now that I can be heard, I find you are marrying the wrong woman, and I intend to be an absolute plague about it. Down the table, Corisande's aunt was explaining the drainage at Marin, and at the sideboard, with a pitcher of small beer in both hands, the bell-maid of the long quiet stood absolutely still with her eyes on the middle distance and her ears. I saw it, and did not understand it. I catalogued it the way a man catalogues a strange bird and walks on, her ears going slowly, deeply red. In the 3rd week, I began to talk back. Not aloud. I am not entirely a fool. The crown does teach you where the walls are thin. But a king spends a great part of his life sitting still in rooms where other people speak, and I had, for the first time in my life, company. "Tell me about the bell," I would say in my skull, in a council I had stopped attending some time before. "Ask her yourself. She cannot speak." "She can write. She writes very well. She wrote her crown, not her mouth in the mud, and you have thought about it 400 times. I did not care to be told so. "Why can I hear you?" I asked him, "only in this house?" And here, for the first time, my wolf went quiet. It was a strange quiet, not the old weather silence, but the silence of an animal that knows a thing and is deciding whether the man is ready for it. "I have always talked," he said at last. "You never had the ear. Nobody has the ear." "Then how?" "Ask her," said my wolf, "what her order keeps." 2 things happened in the 5th week, and they happened 4 days apart, and between them they took me apart like a bell out of its frame. The first was in the glass house. I keep on the south side of Hollowbeam, a long ruinous glass house of my mother's, where nothing very useful grows, and I go when I would rather not be found. There is a stove at the far end and a bench, and in autumn the whole place smells of tomato leaves and rust and my mother. I came down the aisle in the green half-light, and the bell-maid was sitting on my bench. She was up in an instant with her satchel against her chest, and a smudge of bronze black on her cheek, and the look on her face was not fear. It was the flat calculation of a woman working out how large a mistake she has made and who will pay for it. "Tell her to sit down," said my wolf. "Tell her she may sit here every day of her life." "Sit down," I said. She did not. "I sit here," I said, "because nobody thinks to look for me here. I imagine that is also why you sit here." She stood a moment longer. Then she sat at the very end of the bench and set the satchel on her knees and looked at the stove. I sat at the other end. The stove ticked. Rain came on the glass, a long soft roll of it sweeping up from the beech woods. "Say something," said my wolf. And I discovered, sitting 3 feet from a woman who had not spoken to me or to anybody in 3 years, that I did not have to. I do not know how long we sat, long enough for the rain to pass over and the light to change. She took a small green bell out of her satchel and turned it in her fingers and touched the crack in it and grimaced, and I laughed, 1 syllable, ambushed out of me, and she looked up sharply, and the laughter went across her face like a stone skipped over water, and she looked back down at the bell at once. "Oh," said my wolf in an entirely different voice, quietly, almost frightened. "Oh, we love her, do you know that? Do you know that yet, Imric? We love her. Nobody has called me Imric since my mother died. I sat very still with my hands on my knees and my eyes on the rusted stove, while a voice that lived in my chest said the thing I had been not saying since a gray morning in my council chamber. And I did not answer it, because there was nothing in me to answer with. And beside me on the bench, at the very end of it, the bell-maid of the long quiet drew one long, careful, unsteady breath, and put her hand flat on the wood between us, and did not look at me at all. The second thing happened in the yard in front of 40 people, and I did it on purpose, and it is the only cruel act in this whole account. I want it written down. By then I had begun to suspect, not to believe, to suspect, the way you suspect the ice on a pond before you have put your weight on it. I had counted, you see. That is what a king is for. I had counted 11 occasions on which my wolf said something outrageous and the bell-maid's hands went wrong, the ladle stopping over the bowl, the pitcher set down a half-second early, the stillness, the ears going red, and on the last of them, Garrow's nose at a hearing, you could stuff a saddle she had made from behind a pillar, a sound. A very small sound. The sound a person makes when a laugh gets out through the nose before the door is shut. So on a bright cold morning in the 5th week, I came out into the yard where she was setting the tuning frame, with half my household about, and I stood by the mounting block, and I thought, very clearly in the middle of my own skull. Say the worst thing you know. My wolf hesitated. He knew what I was doing. He is not a good animal, he is only an honest one, and he had, I think, been waiting 6 weeks for me to be brave enough to be this contemptible. The King of Thelvane, he said, at a bellow, has been in love with the bell-maid since the 11th of September, cannot sleep, has learned by heart the way she holds her ear to bronze, and would resign the crown tomorrow for one word out of her, and he is going to marry Khorasan of Marin because he is a coward. The bell-maid of the long quiet dropped a 4-pound bronze tuning key on her own foot. The yard turned. Somebody laughed. She went down on one knee to pick it up, and her hands were shaking so badly that she could not close them on it, and when she straightened her face was the color of ash, and she was looking at me, straight through the whole yard and the household in 12 years of weather, and I saw the whole thing land in her at once, everything she had heard for 6 weeks and could not say, and everything she had just now learned about how much she had heard. Her eyes filled. She turned and walked out of the yard quickly, her back very straight, and nobody stopped her, because who stops a maid? And I stood by the mounting block with the whole of my kingdom's mourning going on around me, and my ears ringing like the inside of the grandmother, and I knew. I found her in the bell loft. She had put herself in the corner between the frame and the wall, where she could not be reached without ducking under 4 tons of bronze, and she had her hands over her ears, which is the most useless gesture a woman ever made, and when the light changed she looked up and saw me and did not move. I ducked under the grandmother. I sat down on the boards, on the filthy bronze-black boards, at the length of a bell rope from her, with my back against the frame and my hands open on my knees. "You hear him," I said. She closed her eyes. "How long?" "Nothing. Since the council chamber, the cloak. My voice was not doing what I told it. You have heard him since the first morning." She opened her eyes and looked at me, and I have never in my life been looked at like that before or since. The way a woman looks at a man out of a locked room, through the grill, when she has been listening to him talk to himself in the passage for 6 weeks. Then slowly she lifted her hands. And in my chest, hushed, careful, my wolf began for the first time not to shout at me but to translate. "She says," he said, "that she has heard every wolf in Thelvane since she was 4 years old. She says her mother heard, and her mother's mother, and that they thought it was madness until the long quiet came down the hill and took them up it." Her hands moved on. "She says that is what the vow is for, that is what the order keeps. Not silence, secrets, a pause, her hands unsteady now. She says a hearer who repeats what a man's own wolf says in his own chest is cast out of the house and off the hill, and it has happened 4 times in 400 years, and one of them was hanged for it. She stopped. She had run out of hands or courage. And then slowly, with her chin up and her eyes wet and level, she made one last shape in the air between us, small and flat and final, and my wolf said it so gently that I could have wept. She says, so I could not tell you, not one word, not one in 6 weeks, not even that you were breaking my heart. There is a thing that happens to a man when he learns that every private cruelty he has committed against himself has had a witness. It is not shame. Shame, I know. Shame is a hot, busy feeling, and it wants you to do something at once so that you may stop having it. This was cold and slow, and it did not want anything. It only sat down in me and looked around at what I had built. She had heard me refuse to give her my cloak. She had heard me say in the middle of my own skull, she is not beautiful, she is competent, and she had heard my wolf laugh at me for it. She had heard me lie awake. She had heard on the 11th of September, at a supper table with a good woman on my right hand, the exact hour of my own undoing, and she had gone on pouring small beer, because if she had set the pitcher down and turned around and told one living soul what a wolf had said in a king's chest, they would have taken her off the hill she was born on. She had sat beside me in my mother's glass house for 2 hours while my wolf said we love her, and she had not been permitted to so much as breathe wrong. How do you bear it? I said. Her hands went up, tired now, and my wolf translated in a voice gone hoarse with something I did not know a wolf could feel. She says badly. Then she pressed her palms flat against her eyes and held them there, and her shoulders shook, and I sat 4 feet away under 4 tons of bronze and did not touch her, because I had already done enough to her for one lifetime in a single morning in a yard. At last she scrubbed her face and looked up, and she was, of course she was, furious. Her hands went fast, too fast. Slower, said my wolf mildly. She said something with her hands that made him pause. I'm not repeating that, he said. Repeat it. No. Wolf. She says, my wolf said, with the air of a man reading a summons aloud in his own trial, that you knew, in the yard, that you made me shout it in front of your household to see if she would flinch, and she flinched, and you got your answer, and it cost you nothing. A pause. She says, you tested me like a bell. You struck me to hear what note I'd give. The bell loft was very cold. Yes, I said. She had expected an argument. I watched her not receive one, and I watched it land harder than any argument would have. I struck you to hear the note, I said, because I was afraid to ask, and because a king may do a great many things instead of asking. That is the disease of the office. My father had it, I have it worse. I looked at my hands, which were black with bell dust. I am sorry, not for what I learned, for how. Her hands moved slowly once. She says, what did you learn? And there it was, laid out in front of me on the filthy boards of my own North Tower, the whole clever, cowardly, kingly road I might have taken, because I had learned it. I had learned that she heard me, and that she could not repeat it, and that therefore I could say anything to her forever, with no consequence and no answer. I could love her out loud in a locked chest for the rest of my life and marry Khorasan of Marin on the 8th dawn, and never once put my name to any of it. She would have had to stand at the sideboard with a pitcher and hear it. Don't, said my wolf, so low I barely caught it. Emric, don't you dare. I learned, I said, that you have kept a secret of mine for 6 weeks that I was too proud to keep myself, and that you were given no choice about it, and that I will not add one more word to that burden while you are vowed. She went still. I will not say it to you, I said, not one word, not while you cannot answer me, and not while you cannot walk away from me, and not while I am the only man in Thelvane whose question is also a command. I stood, and my knees cracked, and the grandmother rang faintly against my shoulder, a note like a held breath. I will not ask you anything at all. Do you understand me? Not until you are free to tell me to go to the devil. Her hands came up, and hesitated and made one small shape. "That's 3 years," my wolf said. "Then I shall be extremely bored," I said, and ducked under the bell and went down the stair with my heart going like a mill. Behind me in the loft, the grandmother made a sound she should not have made. It was not a strike. It was the shiver a great bell gives when something lands against it, a hand, perhaps, put flat on the bronze to steady a woman who is laughing and crying at once and can do neither out loud. Here is what my council thought was happening in Thelvane that autumn. They thought the king had come at last to his senses about the succession. They thought his sudden interest in the North Tower was piety, or bells, or the hush. They thought the betrothal to Lady Corisande of Marin was as good as sealed, because the king had said so himself, in front of 30 of them, on the first cold morning of the hush. Kings are terrible at telling people things. We are trained out of it young. A king who explains himself is a king who is asking permission. They teach you, and so you stop explaining. And one day you look up and discover that your entire kingdom is running on a sentence you said in a temper before breakfast 6 weeks ago. I intended to go to Corisande. Twice I got as far as her door. "Coward," my wolf observed, on the second occasion. "I am composing what to say." "You have been composing for 4 days. You are a very slow composer. The bell-maid mended a 4-ton crack in 3. Be quiet." "I am never being quiet again," said my wolf with feeling as long as I live. He was at that time insufferable. 6 weeks of speech after 12 years of weather had gone to his head entirely. He commented on Garrow's nose, on the drainage at Marin, on the precise shade of the beech woods, on the way Nella of Ashhill put her ear to bronze, on the fact that I had eaten no supper, on the fact that I had eaten too much supper, and once, memorably, on a bishop. And she heard all of it. That was the joke. That was the whole enormous joke of that autumn, and there were days when I thought I would come apart with it. That in a house of 200 souls there was precisely one who knew what her king was thinking at any given hour, and she was on a ladder, and she was not allowed to say a word. She began in the 6th week to answer. Not in words, and never with her hands where anyone could see. She answered in the only language available to a woman who has taken a 5-year vow and been given 6 weeks of the funniest and most painful eavesdropping in the history of Thelvane. She answered with her eyebrows. My wolf said, in a boundary hearing, that Lord Garrow's argument had the structure of a wet haystack. And across the hall, framed in the tower door with a coil of rope over her shoulder, a bell-maid raised one eyebrow a 1/4 inch and looked at the ceiling. My wolf said, at the hush feast, that if I did not stop pushing the same piece of mutton around my plate he would go and live in a badger. And at the sideboard, a woman set down a pitcher with terrible care and put 2 fingers over her mouth, as if checking that it was still shut. My wolf said on the north stair at dusk, watching her come down black-handed and worn out with a satchel of shims, "She has bell dust in her hair, look at her. She is the best thing this house has held in 400 years." And she stopped 4 steps above me and looked down at me, and her whole grave brown face went so soft and so wretched and so tender that I had to grip the rail. I said nothing. I had promised her nothing. I stood aside on my own stair and let her pass and did not speak, and the not speaking went into me and set like frost. At the bottom of the stair she stopped. She looked back up at me and she raised her hands, and this time she was slow. She made each shape twice, patiently, the way you do for a child or a foreigner. I did not know a single one of them. "I don't understand," I said. She nodded as if that were the correct answer and went out into the yard. And I stood on my own stair and understood that I had promised not to ask her anything for 3 years and had said nothing whatever about learning to hear her. I went up Ash Hill the next morning in the light, with an escort like a sensible man. Keeper Ivan was on the bell frame with a mallet and her sleeves rolled. And she looked down at me from 12 feet with her milky eye and said, "Which is it, sire, the bell or the girl?" "Neither, you." said Ivan, and came down the ladder rather faster than a woman of 70 ought. I sat in the low hall of the long quiet with tallow and bronze filings in my nose and put it to her plainly, because I had discovered, rather late in life, that plainness costs nothing and buys everything. I have a wolf who speaks, I said. She hears him. She has heard him for 6 weeks, and by your law she may not repeat a word of it, and she has kept it, and it has cost her more than it has cost me. I have told her I will not ask her anything while she is vowed. I want to keep that. Ivan turned her cup a quarter turn on the wood. And I do not trust myself, I said. I am the king. I have been obeyed since I was 9. I have never in my life asked for a thing I could not simply have, and I do not know the shape of my own mouth when it tries. I put my hands flat on her table. So I want you to forbid me, in your own house in front of your women. Forbid the King of Thelvane to ask Nella of Ash Hill any question that touches his heart until her vow is out. Say it aloud, and let them witness it, and let me hear it said, because I am not sure that anything short of that will hold me. There was a silence in the hall of the long quiet. 4 women had stopped eating. One had put her spoon down entirely. Keeper Ivan looked at me for a long moment with her one good eye, and then she stood up, and she said it. She said it in the flat, bored, granite voice of a woman reciting a boundary marker, and every hand in that hall went still while she did. Emric Vale, Alpha of Thelvane. In this house you will ask her nothing, and out of this house you will ask her nothing. And if her vow runs 3 years, you will hold your tongue 3 years, and if she should come to you first, you will still ask her nothing until the grandmother has wrung her out. That's the house's word. A pause and one gray eyebrow. Do you accept it? I accept it. Then say so twice, sire, said Ivan. You'll want the second one later. I accept it, I said. I accept it. Twice, said my wolf, hushed. You said it twice. Good, good. Because in 11 days, Emric, you are going to want to break it so badly you will not be able to stand. He was, as usual, right, and as usual, early. Now, said Keeper Ivan, sitting back down and pulling her porridge toward her, was there anything else? Yes, I said, teach me the speech. Every spoon in the hall of the long quiet went down. I know the child's speech, I said. Yes, no, bread, I'm sorry. My mother taught me on the glass-house step. I have been king of a kingdom that talks with its hands for 7 days a year for 12 years, and I have made every one of those 7 days a holiday from being understood. I heard my own voice go and let it. There is a woman in my house who has a great deal to say and no way to say it to me. I am not asking to speak to her. I am asking to be able to listen when she is free. Teach me, I will come up the hill for it. Keeper Ivan put down her spoon. Sire, she said, I have kept this house 40 years. Do you know what the hearers are for? You said keeping secrets. That's what we do, she leaned back. What we're for is that once in a while a wolf-born fool ought to find out what his own second self has been saying all his life, and it is generally a great embarrassment to him, and he is generally the better for it. She looked at me with something that was very nearly warmth. Come up on Tuesdays, bring your own bread, and sire, as I stood, she'll find out. There's no keeping a thing from a woman in this house. That's rather the point of us. Good, I said. I want to be fair to Khorasan of Marin, because everybody in this story has been kinder than me, and she was the kindest of all, and she had every right not to be. I went to her on the 18th day of that autumn in the small green parlor, and I sent out her aunts, and I stood by the window like a schoolboy and said, I have used you badly, and I am going to use you worse by explaining why. And I told her all of it. The council chamber and the cloak and the ringing in my skull, the bell gone sour, the woman on the ladder, the yard and what I had done in the yard which I did not soften, the loft, the vow hers and now mine. Khorasan listened with her chin on her fist and her boots on my mother's footstool, and when I had finished she was quiet for a while, and then she said, 12 years. What? You have had a voice in your chest for 34 years and never heard it, and the first thing it says to you is that a woman thinks you're an idiot. She began to laugh. She laughed until she had to put her head back against the chair. "Oh, Emric. Oh, that is the funniest thing I have ever heard in my life, and I am going to tell it to my grandchildren, and nobody will believe me." Corisande. "Sit down, you're looming, you always loom." She wiped her eyes. "Now be quiet and let me be plain, since it seems to be the fashion this autumn." She sat forward. "I do not want to marry you. I have not wanted to marry you since the second week, when I watched you eat a whole supper without noticing it and stare at a tower. I want Marin. I want to drain the low fields and rebuild the mill and put my mother's holdings in order and be answerable to no man about any of it. And I have wanted that since I was 16. And the crown of Thelvane was the price my aunts told me I would have to pay for a seat at my own table." She stood up and put out her hand, palm up, like a farmer at a horse fair. "Give me Marin," said Lady Corisande. "Outright. In writing. Give me the mill and the low fields and the right to sit my own hall, and I will stand up in your hall in front of your council and your bishop, and I will refuse the Alpha King of Thelvane so publicly, and so thoroughly that not one man in this kingdom will ever dare to say she stole you from me." "Marry her," said my wolf, in tones of enormous respect. "Be quiet," I said aloud, and Corisande said, "What?" "Nothing. My wolf is an admirer." "He has excellent judgment," said Corisande of Marin, "which he clearly gets from neither of you." She did it 4 days later, and I have never seen anything better done. The hall was full, the council, the bishop, the households, the aunts, the whole of Hollowbeam with the hush 2 days off and the year's business to be shut. Corisande came down the middle of that hall in green with her hair up like a woman going to war, and she stopped in front of the dais, and she did not kneel. "Sire," she said, in a voice that reached the back wall, "it is said in this house that I am to be betrothed to the king before the hush." 30 men studied the table. "It is said," said Corisande, "in this house and in every house between here and Marin, and I have let it be said, and I find I do not care to let it be said any longer, so I will say something instead." She looked around at them, one by one, taking her time. "I decline." There was a sound in that hall like a herd of cattle turning over in the dark. "I decline the crown of Thelvane," said Corisande of Marin pleasantly, "with all courtesy and no grievance whatever, and I go home to drain my low fields. And I will say further, since my aunts have gone the color of whey and may as well hear it all at once, that the king has done me no wrong of any kind, and that any man who suggests otherwise, in this hall or in his cups or in a letter to my mother, will find that I ride better than he does and have a longer memory." She held out her hand. I put the deed in it. She looked at it and read the whole thing in front of everybody at her own pace, which took some time. "Marin," she said, "outright." "Outright." Corisande of Marin folded my kingdom's second-best land into her sleeve, and bowed to me, and turned to go and stopped, and looked up deliberately at the tower door. The bell-maid of the Long Quiet was standing in it, with a coil of rope over her shoulder, and her face perfectly blank. "Bell-maid," said Corisande into a silent hall, "is she true, that great old thing up there? Will she ring on the 8th dawn?" And Nella of Ash Hill, who had not spoken to a living soul in 3 years, looked back at the woman who had just handed her a kingdom's worth of nothing at all, and put out her hand and rocked it flat nearly, and then closed it into a fist and struck it, once, softly, against her own breastbone. "She says she'll ring true," my wolf whispered. "She says." The crack was never in her voice. "Good," said Corisande, and swept out, and 40 people turned around to look at a maid on a tower stair, and the maid, with great composure, went up her rope. "Now," said my wolf. "No. Now you promised her nothing. You promised Ivane, and Ivan isn't." I said it twice. I told him and went back to my chair, and gripped the arms of it until the carving printed itself into my palms and got through the rest of the morning. And it was, to that hour, the hardest thing I had ever done in my life, and it was about to be surpassed. At sundown on the 24th day, Thelvane went quiet. You have not heard silence until you have heard a kingdom take one on purpose. The bells stop, and then, because the bells have stopped, the market stops, and the drover's whistles, and the mill. And by the second day even the dogs have given it up, and the beech woods are so loud with dropping leaves that you cannot sleep for the noise of them. 7 days. Hands only. The whole house going about in a great tide of small, precise gestures, kitchen boys chattering with their fingers over the bread, my steward running hollow beam entirely from her wrists, the bishop sulking magnificently in a corner because he cannot preach, and a king in the middle of it, who had been going up Ash Hill on Tuesdays with his own bread in a bag. I was very bad. I want that recorded too. I had a soldier's memory and a fool's hands, and Keeper Ivan rapped my knuckles with a mallet handle 4 separate times, and I got bread confused with forgive me for a solid fortnight, which I am told the house still laughs about. But on the second day of the hush I stood in my own hall and watched the bell-maid come through with a satchel, and I lifted my hands and said, badly, slowly, in the child's dialect of a language I had held a holiday from all my life, "Is the bell well?" She stopped as though she had walked into the frame of a door. She turned around. She looked at my hands. She looked at my face. And then Nella of Ash Hill, 3 years silent, put both her black-nailed hands over her mouth, exactly as she had at the sideboard, but her eyes above them were not laughing at all this time. She lowered her hands. "The bell is well," she said slowly twice, "the way you speak to a child or a foreigner, and you are late." "I am," I said, "very. I am 12 years late." 6 weeks, she corrected. 12 years, I said. He has been talking to me for 12 years. And the bell-maid of the long quiet stood in the middle of my hall in the middle of the hush and laughed at the King of Thelvane, silently, helplessly, with her fists pressed against her eyes. And I did not say one word to her that touched my heart, and neither did she to me, and it was the best week of my life to that day. We talked about bells. We talked about the crack in the grandmother's crown and the bronze key driven cold, and why a bell goes flat in wet weather. We talked about her mother, who heard, and her mother's mother, who heard, and about the hound that would not leave her at the smithy when she was 4 because she had told it, in plain words, that its man was dying and it had better go home. We talked about my mother's glass house, and what would grow in it if anybody bothered. She told me, in hands that had grown quick and merciless with me by the 5th day, that my hush speech was so bad it was a national embarrassment, and that Lord Garrow's was worse. And on all of it my wolf sat in my chest, silent, watchful, and did not say one word either, because he was a better animal than his king, and because he had been waiting 12 years for me to have something to say with my own hands. Not once in those 7 days did I ask her anything. Not once did she answer. We were both of us, I think, holding the grandmother's rope. The 8th dawn came up gray and still, with frost in the hollows and the whole valley waiting. They were on the hills. That is the thing nobody tells you about the ringing out. The whole kingdom comes out and stands on the high ground in the dark, in blankets, with their breath going up, and the villages hold their own bell ropes and wait for the grandmother, because no bell in Thelvane may speak before she does. The frame was full, my council, my household, Keeper Ivan and 4 women of the long quiet up from the hill in grey, the bishop restored to fluency, Khorasan who had not gone home yet and did not intend to miss this, 200 souls in a cold north tower and on the stair below it and out into the yard, and not one sound out of any of them. And under 4 tons of bronze, alone in her working clothes, with her sleeves pinned back and her hands black, the bell-maid. She did not look at me. She put her palm flat on the grandmother's waist and shut her eyes and stood like that for a long moment, listening to a thing that had not made a sound in 7 days. Then she took the rope. "Emric," said my wolf, very quietly in the ringing dark, "whatever comes, I want you to know that these have been the best 6 weeks of my life, and that I have loved you all along, even when I could not say it, and that this is what she has been doing for you since September. I did not trust myself to answer him. Nella of Ashhill set her feet, she hauled. And the grandmother of Thelvane, 4 tons of bronze with a bronze key driven cold into her crown, spoke. I have heard that bell all my life. I heard her at my mother's burying and at my crowning, and at every year's turn since I was a boy. I have never heard her as I heard her that morning, standing 8 feet from the woman who mended her. Not the strike, the hum after it, the long bronze word that gets into the stone and the boot soles and the wet of your eyes, going out over the beech woods and the hollows and the frost, and then, faint, a mile off, a village bell answering and another, and the whole gray valley waking up and speaking at once, 10,000 voices agreeing on one word after 7 days of holding it in. The year turned over. 200 people in a cold tower began, at last, to make noise. And Keeper Ivan of the Long Quiet stepped forward under the swinging bell, and took the rope out of the bell-maid's hands, and said, in the flat granite voice of a woman reciting a boundary marker, "The house has heard her, she's rung the year in, what she's owed she's paid." The noise stopped. "Nella of Ashhill," said Ivan, "you're 2 years shy of 5, and I'm the keeper, and it's mine to say. The vow was for the keeping of what you hear, and you have kept it under a load I'd not have wished on a woman twice your years, in a house full of talkers, with a fool of a king shouting his heart across your ear every hour of the day. Her one good eye went to me and back. You've kept it. It's enough. The house releases you." She put her hand on the bell-maid's black hair. "Speak or don't," said Keeper Ivan. "That's yours now. Nobody in this kingdom will ask you twice." And she stepped back, and left her standing alone under the grandmother, in front of 200 people, in the first noise of the new year. Nella did not speak. She stood there with her hands at her sides and her chest going, and the whole tower waiting. And she looked at Ivan and at Khorasan and at the bishop with his mouth open, and at my council. And then she turned her head and looked at me. And I did not ask her. I want that written down more than anything else in this account. I was released. Ivan had said it aloud in front of the house and the crown. Nobody will ask you twice, and I could have asked her once. Every man in that tower expected me to. My wolf was screaming. I put my hands together instead, and I made slowly, badly in the child's speech, my mother taught me on a glass-house step. "I'm sorry." And then worse and slower, because Ivan had rapped my knuckles 4 times over it, and it never would sit right in my fingers. "Come and see the glass house. Nothing grows in it." There was a silence in that north tower. The bell-maid of the Long Quiet looked at the King of Thelvane, who had asked her nothing at all, and her mouth began to shake at the corner, at that place where laughter goes to hide. And she lifted her hands, and in a voice I had not heard for 7 days, my wolf said, wondering, she says. And she dropped her hands. She crossed the loft in 4 steps, and she took my 2 hands in her 2 black ones, and she turned them over, and she pressed her thumbs into my palms hard enough to hurt, and she held them. That was all. That was the whole of it. 200 people, and a bishop, and a bell still ringing, and a king standing under it with his hands held by a woman who did not say one word. "Oh," said my wolf, and then nothing else for a long while. She did not speak for 2 more years. That surprised everyone but me, and it should not have surprised anyone who had been paying attention, which is a thing I had lately made rather a study of. Ivan had said speak or don't, and Nella of Ashhill, having been handed a choice for the first time in her adult life, chose to keep the thing that was hers. She had told me once on the 4th day of the hush that a hearer's silence is not an absence, it is a room. She had built hers at 19 and lived in it, and heard every wolf in Thelvane come and go through the walls of it, and she was not going to be turned out of it by 200 people in a tower and a king with poor hands. So we were married in it. You will want to know about that, and I will disappoint you. There was no cloak, no crown, no ceremony stopped in the nick of time. There was the bishop sulking, and the beech woods going bare, and a great deal of bell work, because a queen of Thelvane may hang bells if she likes and nobody has yet found the law against it. There was Corisand, who came up from Marin with a mill ledger and a black eye from a horse and stood as witness. There was Keeper Ivan, who wept, in a manner so terrifying that the bishop retreated behind a pillar. And there was a woman in grey homespun, at an altar in front of everybody, who lifted her black-nailed hands and made 3 shapes in the air, and a king who had been going up a hill on Tuesdays for a year, who read them, and answered in his own, and 200 wolf-born of Thelvane in that church, who read them both. There was not one sound in the building. Afterwards, Garrow told me it was the loudest wedding he had ever attended. We had 2 years of it. 2 years of a marriage conducted entirely in hands and in bells, and in the ridiculous constant din of a wolf who had spent 12 years mute and had now discovered that he could gossip about the council to a woman who was legally permitted to laugh. I learned her hands the way a man learns a country he has been living in without a map. I learned that she had 11 distinct signs for idiot, graded by affection. I learned the sign she made when the grandmother sounded true, which was to touch her ear and then open her hand, like a woman letting a bird go. I learned that she talked in her sleep, the sheets full of small movements, arguments with somebody, a bell being tuned in the dark, and that I could lie awake and read it, and that I never once told her what she said, because a woman is entitled to her own room. And I learned in the second winter that when she was very tired and very happy she would put one hand flat on the wood between us and leave it there, palm down, exactly as she had on a bench in a ruined glass house in the rain, on the day my wolf told me I loved her. I had that glass house mended. Nothing much grows in it still. That is not the point of it. Her 5 years came out on a wet afternoon in the second week of September, without ceremony, because Nella had refused a ceremony with a single gesture so eloquent that Ivan had laughed until she coughed. We were in the glass house. The stove was going. She was mending a village bell on her knees on the brick floor with her sleeves pinned back, and I was reading a report about the drainage at Marin, which is, I regret to say, the great achievement of my reign. The rain came on the glass, a long soft roll of it, sweeping up from the beech woods. I did not look up. I want that understood. 5 years and 2 of them married, and I did not look up, because I had promised a woman on a filthy loft floor that I would never ask her for a word, and because I had said it twice to keep her Ivan in front of witnesses, and because in 19 years of ruling I had learned exactly one thing worth the crown, which is that the moment you cannot buy or command or deserve is the only one worth waiting for. The tapping of her hammer stopped. The stove ticked. And a voice I had never heard in my life, hoarse, rough as a rope, cracked in the crown from 5 years of not being used, and the finest sound ever made under any roof in Thelvane, the grandmother not excepted, said, "Idiot." The report went into the tomato beds. She was sitting back on her heels with one hand over her mouth and her eyes enormous, appalled at herself, listening to the ruin of her own voice as if it belonged to a stranger who had wandered in out of the rain. Her hand came away. Her mouth worked. She tried it again, carefully, testing it the way she tested bronze. Rick. Yes, said my wolf, wrecked. Yes, that's us. That's our name. And I went down on my knees on the brick floor of my mother's glass house among the tomato leaves and the rust, and I took my wife's black-nailed hands in mine, and I did not say anything at all, because for once in my life there was nothing whatever that needed saying, and I had finally, at the age of 39, learned how to hear. She leaned her forehead against mine. Then she put one hand flat on the brick between us, palm down, and left it there.